Free and clear of the chatter from Wall Street, you're listening to Talking Stocks Over a Beer, hosted by hedge fund veteran and newsletter writer Mike Alkin, who helps ordinary investors level the playing field against the pros by bringing you market insights and interviews with corporate executives and institutional investors. Mike sifts through all the noise of mainstream financial media and Wall Street to help you focus on what really matters in the markets. And now, here is your host, Mike Alkin.
It's Monday, October 7th, 2019. Hope you had a good weekend. I had a nice weekend. Starting to get some fall weather here in New York. Although this morning I go outside to take the kids to school and it's in the 70s, so not quite what I wanted. But Saturday night I was at my son's lacrosse game and wearing a hat, had some gloves on. It was in the 40s. It was perfect. And got a little lucky. And here I am, right? You talk about you never satisfied weather-wise. I'm always looking forward to the next season. But I guess that's when you live in a climate that has 4 solid seasons. You always, you have to adapt. But one of the dads we were laughing in the stands because it was like high 40s, and he was playing on a field that was right by the Long Island Sound. And when the winds are kicking up there, I mean, it could be brutal. But here it was 47 maybe degrees, and the wind was just starting to come in off the Sound a little bit. And we were joking because we were saying, one of the dads said, here, look at all of us. We're sitting here freezing, yet if this were April, we'd be excited and we'd probably be in T-shirts because we're coming off of a tough winter. So it was good. It's good to get the chill back in the air. So pretty excited about that. And I don't think I mentioned it last time, or maybe I did, but I don't think I did. A couple of weeks ago, I was cleaning my grill and I bent down and just to get the scraper, and I threw my back out. It literally felt like somebody shot me, and it was agonizing. And I thought, oh, you got to be kidding me. And so for the whatever day it was, I couldn't really move for a day or so, and it was ridiculous. And so then my daughter said, Dad, you should try the acupuncturist. And she has an autoimmune disease, and part of that is she gets side effect is rheumatoid arthritis that she has. And so sometimes it gets to her, and she uses an acupuncturist, and it does wonders for her. And so I said, okay, let me try it. And I went, and in less than a week, in 3 sessions, it's brand new. I mean, I couldn't move. Trying to get out of bed in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom, it was ridiculous. My wife was laughing because trying to see me roll out of bed and get there, not laughing, but just saying like, look at you, you're an old man. What's wrong? But I have to say, if I don't know, what people's views are on it, but for me, I have to tell you, it was game changing. So I'm very excited back that. Now I'm back. I just got a Peloton. We ordered a Peloton for the house, the bike, and it's been great. I don't know. Actually, the stock just came public, and I don't have an opinion on it, except they spend a lot of money to not earn a lot of money, but hopefully eventually they get there, I guess. But for them, for shareholders, I don't really care on it. But I have to say, if it's pretty interesting. It's an interesting concept. My daughter and my wife go to SoulCycle, which is packed all the time. What a business that is! But it's spinning class basically. But they go and they pay their $35 each time. And every time I turn around, my daughter's at SoulCycle and my wife. And so we bought a Peloton to have in the house, and it's pretty cool. You got a great screen. You have a choice of, I think it's 12,000 rides you can do with different instructors. I don't know how many they have, maybe 12, 15. And you can do live classes online, but you have a nice tablet on the bike in front of you. It's connected. So you can take live classes or the library. I think it is 12,000, and all different rides. You could filter it by genre of music. You could filter it by time, by the type of workout you want. And what's pretty cool, because I had a spin bike, but it was an old spin bike, but you could see, you never knew. I mean, am I going fast? Am I going slow? You could figure that out, but you really don't have your cadence. You don't know what your output is. You don't know really any sense of how many calories you're burning, how far you've gone. But on this bike, on the screen, it tells you everything, and it's a great motivator. And on the right side of the screen, it shows you all the people who are either in the live class or have taken it all time. So there's like a lobby, so you could see who's in that lobby, and then you could compare it, and you could see. So it's kind of motivating because you could move up, and people use screen names like they do on Twitter, so you have no idea really who most people are. But you could see, okay, what's my output? And gosh, if I could just move a little bit faster. And I have to tell you, after 45 minutes, it's 45 minutes to an hour, depending on which you do. But you're drenched. It's a 45-minute, 1 hour workout that you burn 650 calories, and really spent. And like you feel it, the cool down, just getting done and doing whatever. It's a good 30 minutes by the time your body starts getting back. And you can actually feel it throughout the rest of the day. You could kind of feel, you're still pumped up. So I'm pretty impressed. Customer service was great. It was a great experience. They came, they delivered it. They were here in 20 minutes. They did what they had to do. Really polite people, very courteous when they called to say they were coming. They were there when they said they would be there. So again, I don't own the stock. I haven't researched the stock, but I was very excited about the experience. So for whatever that's worth. And then this weekend, I'm not going to have a guest this weekend because I got to thinking. I got there's an investor in the fund that I run, and always a smart guy, and always trying to come up with ideas, and has a friend of his who is not an investor, but emails me once in a while and is trying to learn about the nuclear power space, and that's what what I focus on. And so I've spent years now researching the renewables, the alternatives to nuclear power, the safety of nuclear power, the waste stream. All right, because people are worried about the waste, and long before ever decided to express that view in a vehicle, got very comfortable with that. But what happens though, and you see it on Twitter, you see it in other places, people will want to question that and ask questions about it. After years of doing it now and staying on top of it every day and understanding the role, sometimes it's a little exhausting, right? But for people who are learning it, it's all new. And so I'd like to always hear, maybe they've got some insights that I don't have, and certainly I don't have a lock on the insights on that. So I'm always wide open to it. And this one guy was emailing me this weekend and last week with a lot of questions and opinions, a little bit more. Had more opinion than fact, way more opinion than fact, and I was tolerant for a while. And of that. I don't actually tend to not be too tolerant when arguments are not fact-based. So I tend to be a little bit more forceful in my views and my time with people who are more driven by either a singular view or not backed by great research. But hey, what are you going to do? Sometimes you give a courtesy to people, and so it got me to thinking. One of the people that when I was researching and doing a lot of work for a long time, and I still follow, and I've had as a guest is Mike Schellenberger, and Mike grew up in a pacifist family. I think a Mennonite family, and grew up always camping and doing all sorts of stuff. And he grew up to be a real environmentalist, and very pro wind, pro solar, pro renewables. And he wound up really making that his life's vocation, and was instrumental in getting this renewable movement under the Obama administration. I think he said at one point they spent $150 billion over a several-year period, and he did that. And then all of a sudden, over time, he started to become disillusioned with it, with the promise of renewables, and he started to look at and I should say Mike Schellenberger from the is a well-known, he's a time hero of the environment, and he is with the environmental progress. He's the founder and the president of Environmental Progress, and but Mike was did a lot of work, smart guy, and he eventually became a real supporter and activist for nuclear power. So he switched sides, right, if you will. He's still for clean air, but he switched sides, and he started doing his research, and he's become very vocal, and he's a big believer. And his view is, hey, renewables can't save the planet. And as I was going back and forth in emails with this fellow, I revisited some of Mike's work after I because what I really want to say is just read this, because this is what I think, because I've done a lot of research on it. This is my view, and here it's a weekend. Leave me alone. I've got kid stuff to do, but anyway, so and it was interesting, and Mike has a really good piece out there, which is, if you haven't read it, I really go to the website Environmental Progress, and you'll see some of his recent writings, and it kind of just forms. It's not it doesn't form my opinion, but the research that went into it, and this was, I think he wrote this sometime this year, but a couple of years ago, you could piece it all together. I just didn't write a public piece on it, but this kind of summarizes about my views on it, and I think it gives, for those people who are trying to explore what's their view, right? Trying to form a view, renewables versus nuclear versus fossil fuels, and last week had Don Watkins on, right? Who edited the book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, right? So I'm trying to bring some different aspects to this stuff. And, so I would recommend reading that, but I'm going to kind of summarize for you here, because I think it's kind of worth going over it. And Mike talks about the renewable case and why he says, look, it just can't save the planet. And he talks about, he goes into solar, and he says electricity from solar roofs cost about twice as much as they do from solar farms, but solar and wind farms require huge amounts of land. And then he goes on and he talks about the fact that solar and wind farms require long new transmission lines. And interestingly, those are opposed by local communities and conservationists who are trying to preserve the wildlife, right, particularly birds. But what you really think about it, that the challenge is the intermittency nature of solar and wind. And you've heard, if you've done even a modicum of research, you've heard the old saying, when the sun stops shining and the wind stops blowing, you have to be able to ramp up another source of energy. And without a large-scale way to back up solar energy, use California for an example, they've had to block electricity coming from solar farms when it's really sunny. They've even gone so far as to pay neighboring states to take it from them so they can avoid blowing out the grid. And one of the things we'll talk about is you've heard this battery revolution that's coming down the pike. And there's many reasons that that's not the case, right? Battery storage, if you will, but not on grid scale. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. And there's both technical and economic reasons why that's not likely. And one of the things that you see, and is it does have a big environmental impact. Hawks, eagles, owls, condors, the wind turbines just eat them up. And they weren't really, they didn't evolve. They evolved and learned how to survive, but they didn't evolve and learn how to survive with giant, several 100-foot massive wind turbines spinning through the air. And in some cases, wind turbines are really the most serious threat to a lot of bird species. And same thing with solar farms. They also have a big ecological impact. The land usage is pretty staggering, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. But there's, as you think about this, but there's some real just fundamental problems with the renewable energy business. You can make solar panels cheaper. You can make wind turbines bigger. But at the end of the day, you can't make the sun shine more regularly, or you can't make the wind blow more reliably. And as Mike points out, the environmental implications of the physics of energy. If you're going to produce huge amounts of electricity from weak energy flows, you have to spread them over enormous areas. Right? So one of the problems with the renewables is it's not necessarily fundamentally technical, it's natural. You're dealing with unreliable energy sources that require huge amounts of land that come at a massive economic cost. I know you read the papers. Listen to me, I sound dated. You listen to a podcast, you listen to TV, you read a website, and there's all this talk about how solar panels and wind turbines have come down in costs. And it's true. I mean, you've got these massive one-time cost savings because they're made in these big Chinese factories. But the real issue, though, is that's a one-time cost saving. It doesn't solve the unreliability factor of what they are, the intermittency. If you think about California, between 2011 and 2017, the cost of solar panels declined 75%. Yet electricity prices rose 5 times more than they did in the rest of the United States. Same thing in Germany, right? They're the world leader in solar and wind. Between 2006 and 17, their electricity prices increased 50%. As it spent, I think, $600-700 billion on renewables. Their carbon emissions since then, since 2009, Germany's carbon emissions have been flat. Despite this massive hundreds of billions of dollars investment into its electricity grid. So flat CO2 emissions and a 50% rise in the cost of electricity. France produces a tenth of the carbon emissions per unit of electricity as Germany, and they pay a little more than half of its electricity, half of the electricity cost. Well, 75% of their grid is nuclear power. And then France went on. I mean, they were from their neighbor Germany. They were feeling pressured, and they spent almost $35 billion on renewables in the last 10 years. And what happened? A rise in the carbon intensity of its electricity supply, and electricity prices went up. They had originally planned to wean off of nuclear from 75% down to 50% by 2025, and they came out in the last year and said, we can't do that. It's got to be by at least 2035. And then you hear all the talk about how expensive nuclear is compared to cheap solar and wind. But those are headline numbers. I mean, the fact is 70 to 80% of the cost of a nuclear power plant are upfront, right? There's several billion dollars. What you don't see in those numbers is the cost given for solar and wind that include the high cost of the transmission lines, the new dams, or other forms of battery storage. You come to the part, well, which I hear all the time, but nuclear power, is it safe? And what about all that waste? That's the most common thing I'll hear, nuclear waste. And as Mike points out, every major study since the 1960s, including a recent one by the British medical journal Lancet concludes the same thing. Nuclear is the safest way to make reliable electricity. He brings up the point. He says nuclear power plants are so safe for the same reason nuclear weapons are so dangerous. The uranium used as fuel in power plants and as a material for bombs can create 1 million times more heat per its mass than its fossil fuel and gunpowder equivalents. Because nuclear power plants produce heat without fire, they emit no air pollution in the form of smoke. The smoke from burning fossil fuels and biomass results in the premature deaths of 7 million people per year, according to the WHO. Again, if we were to ask Don Watkins from the moral case for fossil fuels, you're right. I mean, what's his view? He would say, well, by burning those fossil fuels, how many billions of people have we brought into a better standard of living, right? So there's a whole debate around that. But it all comes down to math. You always hear me say it's fourth grade math. I say that all the time when it comes to the case for uranium mining and nuclear power and where we are in the cycle. But everything for me comes down to fourth grade math. If you could add, supply, multiply, and add, subtract, multiply, and divide, and just do the work, you can uncover a lot of truths. But even during the worst accidents, nuclear power plants release small amounts of radioactive particulate from the tiny quantities of uranium atoms split apart to make heat, Mike says. And I agree. Over an 80-year lifespan, fewer than 200 people will die from the radiation from the worst nuclear accident, Chernobyl, and 0 will die from small amounts of particulate matter that escaped from Fukushima. James Hansen, who was a noted environmentalist turned pro-nuclear guy along with Schellenberger, have studied that they think nuclear plants have saved 2 million lives that would have been lost to air pollution. And when you think about the land density, the energy density of nuclear, in California, a solar farm requires 450 times more land to produce the same amount of energy as a nuclear plant. Because it's so energy dense, nuclear requires far less in the way of materials and produce far less in the way of waste compared to energy dilute solar and wind. A single Coke can's worth of uranium will provide all of the energy. As Mike says, I laugh, even the most gluttonous American or Australian lifestyle would require. And that's fair. You could pick on the Americans. The high-level radioactive waste that nuclear plants produce is the very same Coke can of used uranium fuel. And Mike points out that the reason nuclear is the best energy from an environmental perspective is because it produces so little waste and none enters the environment as pollution. If you were to take all of the fuel over the last 45 years of the Swiss nuclear program in canisters, the waste, it's the size of a basketball court where all the spent nuclear fuel is. Solar panels require 17 times more materials in the form of cement, glass, concrete, steel than do nuclear plants, and they create 200 times more waste. Now, you tend to think of solar panels as clean, but the reality is there's no plan anywhere to deal with the solar panels when they come to the end of their 20 to 25-year lifespan. So in nuclear power, you've got 40-year plants that get extended to 60 and 80-year plants. The waste is contained on-site in concrete reinforced casks. Solar panels will last you 20 to 25 years. But there's no plan for the waste, right? So what's going to happen? They're shipped along with other forms of electronic waste to be disassembled, smashed by hammers. And where does that go? It goes in poor communities in Africa. It goes to Asia. All those residents are exposed to the dust from really toxic stuff like cadmium, chromium. And the argument, though, always centers on people thinking that the weaker energies are safer, more natural. And that's kind of understandable, I guess. Until you look at the math, that wind turbines kill more people than nuclear power plants. Mike makes a really good point. It's the energy density of the fuel that determines the environmental and health impacts. Now, yeah, sure. You can stand next to a solar panel and you're not going to have much harm. But and if you stood next to inside a nuclear reactor or right there at full power, you're going to die. But that's why they're contained. But when it comes to generating power for billions of people, the reality is that producing solar and wind collectors and spreading them out over really large areas has vastly worse impacts on human and wildlife. I like the way Mike phrases he talks about when he writes and when he speaks. If you watch his TED Talks, he talks about over the last several hundred years the evolution of humans moving away from matter-dense fuels towards energy-dense ones. You move from renewable fuels like wood, dung, and windmills and towards the fossil fuels of coal, oil, and natural gas, and eventually to nuclear power. And that energy progress is overwhelmingly positive for people's standard of living. And if you think about it, and I had not thought about this till I was talking to Mike and had read some of his stuff. As you stop using wood fuel, you're allowing the grasslands and the forests, they grow back, the wildlife returns. As you stop burning wood and dung in your homes, you no longer breathe the toxic and indoor smoke. And as you move from the fossil fuels to uranium, you clear the outdoor air pollution and reduce how much you heat up the planet. So nuclear, is by what it does, is a revolutionary technology. Really a historical break from fossil fuels, which he argues is significant as the industrial transition from wood to fossil fuels before it. But the real issue, and what we all deal with if you are pro-nuclear, is that it's unpopular. For the last half a century, you've had this concerted effort by anti-nuclear weapons campaigners, misanthropic environmentalists, as Mike calls them, and the fossil fuel industry to fearmonger. And as Mike argues, and I agree, in response, the nuclear industry has battered wife syndrome. They're constantly apologizing for what should be its best attributes: waste, safety. And you've seen the nuclear industry promoting the idea that in order to deal with climate change, we need a mix of clean energy sources, including solar and wind. Like they're trying to they have no cohesive message, because that's not accurate. You don't. They could do it all themselves, but they just want to get somebody on their side. The real reality is France shows that moving from mostly nuclear to a mix of nuclear and renewables leads to more carbon emissions, because you're using more natural gas, right? Because the intermittency, you need peaking plants, and that's usually, right, you can have coal, but it's usually natural gas. And that's much higher emissions, higher prices. The smart guys are the oil and gas guys. They politically align with the renewable companies. And they spend a ton of money on promoting solar to these environmental groups for PR and all that stuff. And if you think about it, it makes sense. If you become active on climate change, you gravitate towards renewables. It's natural. Right? It's harmonizing with society and the natural world. And I love it. Mike points out it's kind of like going to a supermarket and you're buying all natural stuff. But again, just like the stuff you buy in the grocery store that says all natural, you got to really read the label and you got to start asking questions. There's a good piece in the MIT Tech Review last year. It talked about the battery storage, right? Because that's what you need to get grid scale renewables. You need storage for when that wind isn't blowing and sun isn't shining. In California, you're going to have, I think in late 2020, I think Moss Landing comes in. It's going to be a 300 megawatt facility. It's one of, I think, 4 giant lithium ion projects that PG&E has going. And you're seeing a lot of these projects, or a growing number of these efforts, taking place around the world. Right? There's all this optimism that these giant batteries are going to allow wind and solar to displace a growing share of fossil fuel plants. But there's a problem with that. The batteries are way too expensive, and they don't last nearly long enough, which limits the role they can play on the grid. If anyone plans on relying on them for massive amounts of storage as more renewables come online, rather than using a broader mix of low carbon sources, no carbon sources, nuclear, maybe natural gas with carbon capture, it's simply going to be, again, using 4th grade math, uneconomical. So for all the Green New Deal and all the other stuff that's out there and all the excitement about the renewables, who's going to pay for it? So if you think about the battery storage technology today, it's very limited. It's a substitute for peaking power plants, really, if you think about it in reverse. Fueled typically by natural gas. So if you really think about the role that these renewable plants can play, it's really a peaker role. I think the projections are the California storage projects could eventually replace 3 natural gas facilities, 2 of which are peaker plants. But when you start to get beyond that, your batteries run into real problems. You get diminishing returns when you add a lot of battery storage to the grid. And if you think that coupling battery storage with renewable plants for large, flexible coal or natural gas combined cycle plants, I mean, they're a weak substitute. The others can be tapped at any time. They can run continuously. And they can vary output levels to meet shifting demand throughout the day. Lithium ion is too expensive for that. But you also have limited battery life. So it's not well suited for filling gaps during the days, weeks, even months when wind and solar generation isn't cranking. And you see that problem in California. Wind and solar fall off a cliff during the fall and winter months, which, as the MIT piece points out, leads to a very critical problem. When renewables reach high levels on the grid, you need far, far more wind and solar plants to crank out enough excess power during peak times to keep the grid operating throughout those long seasonal dips. And that requires banks upon banks of batteries that can store it all away until it's needed, which becomes astronomically expensive, as they point out. Now, California is on track to get half its electricity from clean sources by 2020, and they want to get 100% by 2045. Then some work was done by the Clean Air Task Force, which is this Boston-based energy policy think tank. And they concluded that reaching the 80% mark for renewables in California would mean massive amounts of surplus generation during the summer months, requiring 9.6 million megawatts hours of energy storage. Achieving 100% would require 36.3 million. They currently have 150,000 megawatts. Again, reaching the 80% mark for renewables would mean massive amounts of surplus generation during the summer months, requiring 9.6 million megawatt hours of energy storage, and achieving 100% would require 36.3 million. They currently have 150,000 megawatt hours of storage. And that's mainly pumped hydroelectric storage with a small share of batteries. and the fourth grade math behind it, building the level of renewable generation and storage necessary to reach the state's goal would drive up costs from 49 per megawatt hour of generation at 50% to $1,612 at 100%. And that's assuming lithium-ion batteries will cost roughly a third of what they do now. So the system becomes completely dominated by the cost of storage. You build up this huge storage machine that you fill up by mid-year, and then you just draw it down. This huge capital investment that gets utilized very little, which dramatically increases the cost for consumers. There was a study last year in Energy and Environmental Science which found that meeting 80% of U.S. electricity demand with wind and solar would require either a nationwide high-speed transmission system which can balance renewable generation over hundreds of miles, or 12 hours of electricity storage for the whole system. Cost, $2.5 trillion. $2.5 trillion. Where's that coming from? We're just talking about the land usage. Let's do some math. A 1,000 megawatt nuclear facility needs about 1 square mile. And there's no U.S. wind or solar facility that generates as much as the average nuclear power plant, right? We just talked about one going up California, 300 megawatts. So 1,000 megawatts, a gigawatt, is 3 times bigger. Now, if you're looking at a wind farm requires up to 360 times as much land area to produce the same amount of electricity as a nuclear energy facility. Solar photovoltaic requires up to 75 times. There's a 2015 report called Land Requirements for Carbon-Free Technologies, and it compared the land area that various types of electricity generation facilities would require to produce the same amount of electricity as a 1 gig nuclear power plant, 1,000 megawatts. A nuclear energy facility has a small area footprint requiring about 1.3 square miles per 1,000 megawatts. Now, they took that figure based on the median land area of the 59 nuclear plants in the United States, the sites. And they have an average capacity factor of 90%, right? So obviously much higher than the intermittent sources of wind and solar, which, wind farm capacity ranges from low 30s to mid 40s, depending on the differing wind resources in a given area. And you get some improvements in turbine technology, so on and so forth. And then your solar PV, high teens, high 20s. So taking capacity factors into account and thinking of everything, a wind farm would need an installed capacity between 1,900 megawatts and 2,800 megawatts to generate the same amount of electricity in a year of a 1,000 megawatt nuclear energy facility. And that facility required 260 square miles and 360 square miles, depending on it, 19 to 2,800 of land. For solar PV, you need an installed capacity of 3,300 to 5,400 megawatts to match a 1,000 megawatt nuclear facility, requiring 45 and 75 square miles. I want to put that in context. The District of Columbia's total land area is 68 square miles. Manhattan is 34 square miles. And if you take in the 5 boroughs, that's 305 square miles. There's no wind or solar facility currently operating in the U.S. large enough to match the output of a 1 gig reactor, 1,000 megawatts. So again, though, people think, and it triggered me. This guy who was emailing me was the second part of a conversation I was having about this, but with a good friend of mine who is a utility executive that does not have nuclear power in their mix, but he's a good friend of mine. I've known him for many years, and I have great confidence in his intellectual honesty and his knowledge. And we had breakfast, and I said, "How you doing?" He said, "I'm good." He said, "I had a lot of hysteria over green energy, UN Climate Week." He said, "It's just crazy when you think about the what people are being sold out of fear." Right? You've got this view on the renewables with the costs that are impossible to get at any size scale. And he said it's all being shoved down their throats by politicians and subsidies. He said, I have no doubt 50 years from now, whatever it is, that technology will keep advancing and improvements will keep coming, and that will get better and cheaper way over time. He said, but you're not letting it grow organically. It's being fed GMO by the politician, the GMO modified, right? Genetically modified. It's being modified by the politicians because they want to pander to their constituents. And it's just not affordable. And they have done, and this utility has a ton of renewable projects. Right? So he said, what if you went to industry in 1990 and said, by 2008, you have to have a handheld device with computing power, or not by 2008. He said, if in 1990 you went and said, I want in the next few years a handheld device that has enough computing power that took the men to the moon, that could have cameras on there, that can do everything, but it's got to be done in a few years. And if we don't have it, we're not going to be able to function as a society. Right? Steve Jobs figured it out. They came up with something that took them 20 years. But it wasn't being mandated to be done immediately. And the disruption that it causes, that all of these dollars are being put into this, and all of this fear is being put into it on the renewable front. And who's paying for it? So just something to think about. Google a bunch of stuff. Look at the real math. Look at different studies. Avoid the headlines. Read the headlines. Take that view and then see if there's an alternative view to it. And apply some fourth grade math. Take out the fear and apply some logic to it. And if you conclude that then wind and solar are the way to go, renewables are the way of the future, and they probably are at some point, and some level of them and some mix, then at least you're informed. Anyway, I just wanted to share that because I had a couple of these two interactions this week. I thought first with my buddy, the utility executive, and then secondly the guy who's been emailing me, which isn't going to last that much longer. Anyway, great time of year. I mean, I don't even know what to watch between the NHL season starting. Islanders start off 1-1. You're going to be hearing a lot from me this year on the Islanders. Win or lose, I'm committed to keeping my opinions out there. Had 2 playoff baseball games yesterday. We had NFL football. I mean, Saturday we had college football, NHL, baseball playoffs. I mean, it's a great time to be a sports fan. So that's it from me. Hope you have a great week. Get some good sports watching in. We'll see you next week. Thanks.
The information presented on Talking Stocks Over a Beer is the opinion of its hosts and guests You should not base your investment decisions solely on this broadcast. Remember, it's your money and your responsibility.